Hey there, David Fisher again, just coming back in my male psychology series. Hey there. Hi there, David Fisher here, back with my male psychology series, and using the Parsifal tale to kind of tell the tale of what it means to actually become a mature adult male who's in consciousness. And so in the last video I talked a little bit about why we use myths and depth psychology, and so now I just kind of want to start off by going into where the Parsifal tale begins, which is with the Fisher King. And the Fisher King, no relation by the way, is a king that has been wounded in the thigh. And he's so severely injured that he can't live, yet he's also not dying, and so, or he can't die. And so he just kind of lays in his castle and he's moaning and groaning and in constant severe pain. Basically he's suffering. And so in the beginning of this tale, this is important because this is kind of the midlife crisis state, at least midlife psychic crisis state that men often find themselves in. And this is about the time when generally if men are going to seek treatment or analysis, this is usually when it occurs, is sometime right in midlife, when they have this wound, this festering psychic wound that won't go away, and yet it's with them as they suffer. And so what's interesting is of course, not only is the Fisher King wounded and suffering, which kind of gives us insight into his inner landscape, or his inner world, his psychic world, but his kingdom is also falling apart. The cattle aren't reproducing, nothing's growing, and which means everything and everyone around him in the outer world is also suffering because of his own internal suffering. And so this is kind of it's a representation of the Middle Age crisis, and this is before Parsifal gets introduced. And as we know, if we've read the Parsifal tale, eventually Parsifal heals the Fisher King by asking the right question. And so the other interesting thing to do with the wounded Fisher King is how he got his wound. And his wound, one of the version goes, came from a joust that he had, and he was out on a quest for a love, a sensuous kind of quest. And he ran into a Muslim knight who was also on a quest, but he was on a quest for the true cross, this vision that he had of a true cross. And so this wounding then kind of also tells us a lot about the nature of this wound that eventually, and a lot of us, will come to haunt us in the middle age and cause us to consciously seek a greater consciousness, or our God self, or religion. And so, you know, if you really look at what they were searching for, so the true pure spirit, you know, the sensuousness of spirit, and somebody looking for that, and somebody who is searching for a vision, and these two crash into this thing where, into this joust, I should say, not this thing, but into this joust where the Fisher King is wounded. And so again, if we're using this tale to look at why or how this wound comes about, it really becomes, you know, a quest for greater consciousness. And it can be a great crucible that will hold it, or it could be something that completely tear somebody apart and they just die, their psychic life, they become a kind of a walking husk or possibly even go mad, psychotic because of it. So, now that we kind of touched on the Fisher King, I just want to talk a little bit about how this kind of original wound comes upon us. And as we'll see later on, a boy, usually like a young adolescent boy, say somewhere around 15, 16, somewhere's in there, much like Parsifal will, often has what we would call a numinous experience, or an experience of touching their own divinity, or the seeing of a godhead, or some just wondrous moment that is just touches upon how wonderful and beautiful all this love that's out there in the universe. And they touch it, but they don't know what to do with it, and it can be almost searing. It can be a wonderful, experience like I had, or sometimes it can be an external one where one has been wounded by somebody else. And I can give you a couple examples out of my own life. I remember I was in second grade, but I was sent up to third grade for reading and writing because I was way advanced. And so I'm sitting there, and at the end of, I don't know, the one quarter or whatever, they had a writing contest, and basically they put up 20 or so of what they thought were the hardest vocabulary words that we've been working on for a while. And then we had to use all the words and write a fiction story. And so I wrote it and turned it in, and then next week when I was up there, they had chosen me as the winner, and my teacher had called out, and everybody applauded, and I was getting up to go up to the front, and all of a sudden I saw a couple of the other teachers pull my teacher aside, because this was for all third graders across the entire school. And they had a little conference, and then they came back and said, oh no, David couldn't win it because he's a second grader, not a third grader, and it was it was a contest for third graders. So they gave it to the person who came in second place. And you can imagine how devastating that was, to be recognized, and then having that moment, that really nice moment of sheer joy, just kind of being jerked out from underneath you. So woundings like this can come from that. They can also come from being unjustly accused of doing something that one didn't do. It can also, like I said, be a moment of experiencing that Godhead almost too soon, because you're not quite ready for it. On the other hand, it may be such a wondrous experience that's how a lot of men are called to the priesthood and so on and so forth, because they have this experience and they have enough of a container where they realize the wondrous aspect of it, but it still puts this holy fear or awe into one. As Robert Johnson calls it, or the church calls it, the Felix Culpa, or the happy fall. With the idea that it's a happy fall, much like Christ going to the cross was, considered a joyous occasion, not because one wants to experience that sort of trauma, but because it allows for a later redemption. And so I'm going to wrap up here and just kind of talk about now, in general terms, the three stages of psychological development for a man. And so the first one is the innocent wholeness, where as a child, everything's joy and happiness, and your inner and outer worlds are combined. There's no real sense of duality, and you're just kind of joyful. And then this moment, this wounding, occurs, and in that, this felix culpa, and when that happens, suddenly, there from adolescence until typically about middle-aged, one lives in a sort of this duality, where the inner and outer worlds have been split off into separate, different worlds and are no longer kind of this joyous naivety to life. And that sets us up for the last and final stage, which is, if one is called, which one typically is, in middle age, one will suddenly start to realize it's a calling to set the stage for wisdom, for cynics. And the mature male will then start putting his life, his psychic life and his outer world back into a unified consciousness, whereby there's again a wholeness, but now, unlike in a youth, it's a conscious wholeness. It's the way it's been thought through, it's processed. There's a holiness, divinity to it. And so with that, setting the stage on my next segment, we will begin with Parsifal and the first task of a young boy, which is, just as a teaser, is to leave his mother.